wild. It was just like this massive boom. I thought we were being bombed, and my mom just yelled from her room, "Hold on to your bed! Hold on to your bed!" I had a shotgun rack over my, or a gun rack over my bed. Shotgun came down and temporarily knocked me out, and I could hear my mom yelling, "Brad, Brad, what's wrong?" And because I was stunned, I didn't respond, and then finally I responded, and the earth had stopped moving, but it was this loud boom that made us feel like, or made me feel at the time, that we were being bombed, and it was a major shake that morning. And then, because my father, Joseph Heavey, was the acting director at the hospital at the time, we had walkie talkies, and we always had walkie talkies in the house because we were always connected to the guardhouse. And my dad was yelling, grab the walkie talkies, and I could hear the guard yelling over the walkie talkie for my dad. So I grabbed one of the walkie talkies that was in the charger and took it to my dad. I walked down this hallway, and it was a narrow hallway, and all of this glass had fallen on the floor from these pictures that my dad had of Kennedy and the White House. He had visited the White House, and I walked across that glass, and I never cut my feet. And I gave the walkie-talkie to my dad, and my dad said, "Oh my God, I think he said building number 2 is gone." And he got dressed, told me to grab the other walkie-talkie and take care of Mom. And he said, "I'll be in touch." And I can't remember whether my dad drove his car down to where the buildings were, to where his office was, or if he walked down. But I don't, it seemed like maybe a half an hour later, Dad got on the walkie-talkie, and I had the other walkie-talkie with me, and he goes, "Brad, grab my car, go down to the bottom of the hill and find somebody, because we're up here and there's absolutely no help. We have no connection with the outside world." So I grabbed my dad's keys and drove down to the bottom of the hill, and I think that was, I want to say, Glen Oaks, at the bottom of Sarah Street. I think it wasn't Hubbard, because it was one of the streets that was parallel to Sarah Street. Anyway, it was where the Alpha Beta was, and I found a police officer, and I was kind of frantic because of everything that was going on. And I said, "Look, my dad sent me down. He's the director of the hospital. The hospital's destroyed, and we have no contact with the outside world." So he made me show him my identification, my driver's license, and I did. And it showed that I lived at 13,000 Sarah Street. And then he went back to his car, and I guess at that time he made a call. And within a short period of time, I can't remember how long it was, but we started to see helicopters going over above. And I think I saw my dad on top of this building with a bullhorn, giving people directions on what to do. And so anyway, within probably about, maybe it seemed like maybe an hour, life flight started coming in. And I remember we were the only people that were there, besides people that worked at the hospital. There was no outside people that were helping to recover. But life flight came in, and I remember one of the first, I think it was the second trip of life flight. And this is something that impacted me for many, many years. And I didn't really recall it until last week before I came up here. And it was one of the nurses, an African American woman. She was older, she had gray hair. And we had her in one of the cages that they put in the life flight. And we put her on, and I kind of brushed her hair out of the side of her face, and I kind of brushed her face off because it looked like she had this white stuff on her face, but it wasn't white dust. I don't know what it was. I theorized that, and she said, "Thank you." That was the last thing. And I theorized later on that it was her spirit. I mean, this sounds really odd and hard to believe. She died on the way to the hospital in the life flight. So I kind of forgot about that, but that was something that really was, I don't know what the word to use, epic, you might say, in that whole experience. And then the rescue came up. The fire department came up. All the rescue vehicles were coming up the road. And that's when Dad said, we're done. We're out of here. Let them take care and let them take over because they're the experts. And Dad called me aside and he goes, get all your clothes, put it in your car, and we're done here. And I said, we're not coming back? And he said, no, we're not coming back. And it was, if you see the Veterans Park now, and if you can imagine what it looked like prior to the earthquake, it was a paradise. It was 99 acres of this beautiful, tall pine trees, olive trees, every kind of fruit tree you could possibly imagine. And for a teenager growing up in that environment, it was the best place I had ever lived. It was just fabulous. And to realize that we were never going back to that, I think was very traumatic at the time. And still, I think I came back to Somar maybe, I lived in Somar for another year at a friend's house. His mom took me in and I stayed there for about a year. And then I got my own house. I was doing good. I was working as a roofer at the time. And with another high school graduate, Russ Van, he was a good friend of mine. And then I got a call one night from my brother about 10 o'clock, and he goes, Dad had a heart attack and we have to go to San Diego now. So we got in the car, drove down to San Diego, and my dad died that night. And it was almost 1 year. It was February 6th, 1972 that he died. So then I moved down to San Diego and helped my mom get through her challenges, and I ended up working at the VA hospital in La Jolla because that was the hospital that my dad had opened. And it was a very interesting time because there was a lot of tragedy. I was involved in a lawsuit for an automobile accident that I was in the year before. I'm sure that created some stress on my dad. I had a steel rod in my leg, and that year the rod had been removed, so I was in the hospital for a few days. And it was a very traumatic time. But it's like anything that's tragic in your life, you have to accept that challenge and then just move on. That's why we had the walkie-talkie system. It was for the hospital grounds, but the emergency procedures for the county were designed in, I never really saw it, but it was some kind of a box, and it had communication system, and I think it had a telephone in it. It was destroyed during the earthquake. So that's the reason why we had no communication with the outside world. So my dad was a civil defense expert because he ran fire drills through another hospital that he was an assistant director at. He ran fire drills at the VA in Somar because I remember seeing pictures of the fire trucks. But Dad went to Congress and testified that this system failed. This whole system in the whole county failed because there was no communication for this one hospital. So Dad ended up getting a Purple Heart for the lives that he saved because of his experience in civil defense. He coordinated this whole effort in the very beginning. You know, probably his knowledge about civil defense and telling me to go down and get help was probably one of the most important things to save so many lives, because over 300 lives were saved because of the actions my dad took really early on. And as many people know or don't know, the biggest tragedy was at the VA in Somar. that was where the most lives were lost, because if you, and you probably have pictures of this, building number 2, I think it was called building number 2, it was pancaked. It was literally pancaked because of the way that hospital had been constructed. It was built in the 1920s, and it was built with what they call clay cone blocks, and it had no reinforcements. So the only building that I recall that really survived everything was the chapel. And the chapel was this beautiful chapel that was, as I recall, non-dimensional or non-religious. It was for many different religions. We're Catholic, and we went to Catholic Mass there regularly. And it was this beautiful little chapel that that I have seen similar chapels like that through my hiking through Spain. I've done a couple of caminos across Spain, and we went to some of these little tiny chapels, and it always brought back the memories of that chapel. Everything was old Spanish. All of the quarters, which we lived on the quarters in the grounds, we were, I think, number 14A, and there were these old Spanish duplexes. And I remember Dad telling me that the chimney had actually collapsed within our half of our duplex, and he had told me later on. Probably a few days later, he said, our house is condemned because there was cracks in there that you could put your fist through. And so that's why we couldn't go back, and that's why he wanted me to get all my clothes. And then we had a moving company go in there, and there was no such thing as cell phones at the time. So it was that walkie-talkie that I had was my only communication with Dad and the hospital grounds. And then it was, within hours. I can't recall what we did that night. I'm pretty sure I went down and stayed with the Nears, and my dad and my mom went with the judges. But I remember that first night, it was cold, it was February, the days were warm, but the nights were cool. And I remember sleeping outside that night. There was all these tremors that were going on constantly, and it was just like every time you felt a tremor, and if you were in a building, you wanted to get out of that building, especially after I saw the demise of the hospital. When you see that, it puts a fright within your system to want to be out in the open so that you're not crushed. Well, I could say that there was some, because it was within just 1 year, it was a tragic event of losing your house. I remember maybe 3, 4, 5 years ago, I gave a speech in Toastmasters about the day I became homeless. And it was all about that day of becoming homeless, not knowing what your future is going to be, your dad dying within a year. There was a lot of tragic events that happened at that time period. So I always remember that woman and the haze on her body, and it's like, was this a spirit? What happened to her? My dad told me she died, and on the way to the hospital. I think what my dad telling me to go get a police officer was probably the best thing that ever happened. And I think it saved more lives because of that. Because whether that triggered the call and there was a helicopter in the area flying over, I don't really know. But it's what happened. Whether I have any permanent damage, I don't know. I'm a person that kind of realizes that you've got memories of something that happened, and you need to move on. You just can't hold your life in a block or a paper bag, and you just need to move on. Yeah. I was raised in an Irish Catholic family, and I went to Catholic school, so I knew about Jesus. I loved Jesus, and it was a time period when I saw that happen, and it was just like an amazing experience to see something like that. And she was light in color. She wasn't really dark African American, but it was just kind of moving her hair away from her face, and her just saying thank you, which was a profound effect on me for many, many years. I kind of forgot about it, but I came back to a spiritual life in 2014 when I hiked the Camino in Spain. It's a 500-mile hike, and realizing that thousands of years ago, the Apostle St. James came across Spain for the word of Jesus Christ, and all of his artwork was incredible in Spain. That kind of brought me back to the church. It brought me back to realizing they did this thousands of years ago of all of this artwork for Jesus. So to answer your question, it was a spiritual moment at the time, but it was like, was it really her spirit? Wasn't I don't know. I don't have an answer to that, but I always theorized that it was for my own well-being. I did something for someone that was probably the last thing anybody did for her, before she died.